The silent disappearance, Lake Mead, and the crisis of the American West, while the world slept through the darkness of last night. The single largest water reservoir in the United States vanished by several million gallons without any human being noticing it. This was not caused by a massive leak or a technical failure of the dam, but simply because the parched air claimed what was once a vast blue desert oasis. Look closely at the giant white bathtub ring encircling the drying basin, which acts as a ghostly reminder of where the deep water levels used to sit 2 decades ago. 40 million people across 7 different states now depend on this single source of life. Yet on this 11th day of April, in the year 2026, it is dying. The current capacity has plummeted to a mere 35%, leaving the massive intake valves dangerously close to the surface of the mud as the scorching sun continues its relentless work. Since the first day of March this year, the surface has dropped by more than 6 feet, which is equivalent to nearly 2 meters in a span of 40 days. These numbers are not just statistics found in a dry federal report. They represent a looming catastrophe that could force entire cities to vanish into the great American Southwest. Dust federal engineers have completed their calculations and now know the projected date when this lake will finally break the worst record in recorded history, a figure that will be addressed at the conclusion of this report. But before confronting that number, it is essential to understand the false sense of security that kept the public largely uninformed. The nation was told that the crisis had resolved itself in the year 2023, when record snowfalls painted the mountains white and gave a misleading impression of lasting recovery. Millions of people celebrated what they believed was the permanent end of the drought. But they failed to recognize the hidden structural flaw in the regional water system that was already beginning to fail them. To understand the true depth of this situation, one must journey into the heart of the desert to examine the grand architectural achievement that is now slowly becoming a monument to collective hubris and prolonged neglect. The clock is advancing toward a zero point that no level of government or engineering is prepared to manage. And the water available today may represent the last affordable supply within reach during the lifetimes of those currently consuming it. What follows is an account of why the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century is losing. A battle against an invisible enemy that no technology can reliably stop. The false promise of 2023. The tragedy of Lake Mead is not simply about water. It is about the survival of modern civilization in a landscape that was never designed to support tens of millions of people. In the year 2023, the western United States witnessed a historic volume of snowfall that blanketed the rugged mountains and filled local news broadcasts with stories of relief and optimism. Journalists and experts appeared on national television with confidence, declaring to an anxious public that the terrifying water crisis had finally reached its peak and was reversing course. But they were completely and dangerously wrong, because they mistook a temporary atmospheric event for a permanent solution to a problem that had been deteriorating for over 20 years. To understand the full scope of this misreading, it is necessary to examine southern Nevada, where a community achieved a technical accomplishment that should, by any reasonable standard, have protected it from this fate. Since the year 2002, the residents of Las Vegas reduced their individual water consumption by an extraordinary 58%, despite experiencing a massive population increase. More than 876,000 new residents arrived during this same period, yet the city used less water than it did when its population was half that size. This was not achieved by forcing residents into hardship or shutting down the famous dancing fountains of the Bellagio, which actually operate using recycled groundwater. Instead, the city enforced strict regulations against non-functional grass, removing millions of square feet of water-intensive turf from suburban neighborhoods and commercial business parks. By the year 2023, the average Las Vegas resident consumed only 89 gallons of water daily, a remarkable decline from the 235 gallons recorded in an earlier era. This city did everything correctly, becoming a global model for water conservation that desert cities around the world attempted to replicate. And yet, despite these monumental efforts and decades of collective sacrifice, Las Vegas is still losing ground because the water levels in Lake Mead continue to fall toward a critical threshold. The cruel paradox is that Las Vegas consumes less than 5% of the total water allocated to the state of Nevada. From the shrinking Colorado River system and Lake Mead, the true driver of this crisis is not the urban resident taking a longer than necessary shower, but rather the absence of what used to accumulate on the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. The winter of 2026 has now confirmed the darkest fears of every hydrologist in America, demonstrating that the recovery of 2023 was nothing more than a temporary reprieve. The nation now faces a sobering reality in which even perfect conservation discipline cannot preserve a civilization when the atmosphere itself ceases to provide the precipitation that everything else depends upon. The snowpack collapse. To understand why Lake Mead is declining so rapidly, it is necessary to grasp a concept that most Americans seldom consider: the snowpack accumulated on the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. This vast mountain range functions as a massive natural reservoir, storing frozen water throughout the winter months before releasing it gradually during the spring melt. More than 90% of the water flowing through the Colorado River and into Lake Mead originates from melting snow rather than from local desert rainfall. Every winter, this natural storage system must be fully replenished by sufficient snowfall to ensure that tens of millions of people have adequate water to survive the summer months. The winter of 2026, however, has delivered a catastrophic blow to this delicate natural mechanism, leaving the entire basin in a state of severe and measurable drought. Scientific data confirms that total snow accumulation across the entire Colorado River basin has reached only 40% of the levels required for a stable ecosystem. In the state of Colorado, where the river officially begins its long journey, the snowpack has collapsed to a staggering 29% of normal, following a record-breaking spring heat wave. Hydrologists have projected that water inflow between April and July of this year will represent only 27% of what is considered normal for the region. This means that more than 70% of the total water volume that Lake Mead requires to remain stable will simply never arrive from the mountains this year. A winter without adequate snowfall in the Rocky Mountains is not merely a weather anomaly. It functions as a delayed structural failure for the infrastructure supporting the entire western United States. While the consequences are not immediately visible to urban residents, the full impact will become apparent during July and August, when temperatures reach 45 degrees Celsius, and the surface of the lake evaporates millions of gallons daily without any meaningful inflow to compensate for the loss. Lake Mead is not declining because of negligence at the individual level, but because the climate system has ceased to honor its long-standing obligations to the region. Federal projections and the dead pool. The federal engineers at the Bureau of Reclamation are examining these figures with growing alarm, recognizing that the margin for corrective action has effectively reached zero. This failure of natural replenishment has produced a situation in which the most sophisticated water management systems ever developed are unable to prevent the approaching crisis. In March of 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation released its latest 24-month study, not a speculative commentary, but an official federal technical document. This report outlines the most probable scenario in which Lake Mead will sit at exactly 1,063 feet above sea level by the 31st day of December, 2026. While that elevation may appear manageable at first consideration, the far more dangerous dry scenario commands serious attention. Under worst-case conditions, the water level could drop to 1,054 feet by the end of this year, threatening the stability of the entire regional water delivery system. The true severity of the situation lies in projections for November of 2027, when the lake is expected to reach only 1,032 feet, a staggering 8 feet lower than the previous record low recorded in 2022, which alarmed observers across the country at the time. To place this in geographic context, that level would be nearly 2.5 meters below anything recorded since the Hoover Dam was first constructed during the 1930s. As the water recedes, objects hidden beneath the surface for nearly a century are beginning to emerge. Rusted wreckage from the 1940s, automobiles that disappeared decades ago, and human skeletal remains are surfacing as the lake retreats. Massive underwater sinkholes are forming, making it unsafe for watercraft to navigate across the receding surface. National Park Service officials have already been compelled to close 5 of the 6 main boat ramps because the lake bed is drying faster than management capacity allows. These ramps are no longer gateways to open water, but have become stretches of cracked, sun-scorched earth leading nowhere. The central question has shifted. It is no longer whether Lake Mead will recover, but what becomes of 40 million people when water stops flowing from their taps. The answer depends in large part on a single massive pipe stretching nearly 5 miles and buried 860 feet beneath the lake floor. This structure represents the final line of defense between the city of Las Vegas and the cascading social consequences of a complete regional water supply failure. For decades, the public accepted the availability of water as a given. But the physical reality of the disappearing shoreline is now impossible to overlook. Every foot of water lost represents billions of gallons that conservation alone cannot restore, pushing the regional infrastructure toward its absolute operational limit. What is being witnessed is the gradual collapse of a regional economy built upon the expectation of limitless, inexpensive water in a naturally arid landscape. The engineers monitoring the dam are watching pressure gauges with sustained focus, understanding that once water drops below a critical threshold, the turbines generating electrical power will cease operation permanently. Intake number 3 and the dead pool. Threshold. This crisis has no genuine precedent in modern American history, and the timeline for its most severe consequences is now measured in months rather than decades. In 2015, after 7 years of construction and an investment of nearly $1.5 billion, Las Vegas inaugurated what became its ultimate contingency measure, intake number 3. This reinforced concrete tunnel, positioned 860 feet below the lake's surface, represents the deepest water extraction project ever completed in the United States. It was engineered specifically to allow the city to continue drawing water, even if the surface of Lake Mead fell so low that both older intake pipes were left entirely exposed and non-functional. But even this extraordinary engineering achievement carries an absolute physical limitation, a threshold known to every federal water manager as the official dead pool. This critical point occurs at 895 feet above sea level, where water pressure becomes insufficient to push any volume through the Hoover Dam. At this level, the dam ceases to function as a source of water and electricity and becomes instead a massive concrete barrier obstructing a dying river. The water behind it will sit motionless and inaccessible, permanently trapped with no means of reaching the populations of Los Angeles, Phoenix, San Diego, and dozens of other communities that depend upon it. This crisis extends well beyond residential water access. The Colorado River also supplies essential irrigation water for the agricultural fields that produce a substantial portion of the food consumed across America. When the water stops flowing, grocery prices will rise sharply nationwide, and the power grid serving the western states will face severe and potentially permanent disruption. The question of where 40 million people will relocate when their desert communities become uninhabitable is no longer an abstraction. It is an approaching logistical and humanitarian challenge of historic proportions. A reckoning without precedent. Recall the projection referenced earlier, November of 2027, when Lake Mead is expected to fall further below recorded history than at any point since the dam's construction. The most troubling dimension of this crisis is not the falling water level itself, but the fact that thousands of new residents continue relocating to these desert cities every month without apparent concern. New golf courses are being irrigated and luxury hotel construction continues to advance, while the very resource sustaining these developments evaporates into the atmosphere of a drying continent. Deeper pipes can be engineered, and wastewater can be recycled with ever greater efficiency. But no technology can manufacture the winter snowpack that a warming atmosphere has systematically reduced over decades of gradual climate shift. Standing at the edge of this developing catastrophe, the final question is no longer one for engineers or federal planners alone. It is a question for every individual and every family currently residing in the American Southwest. The primary source of life for this region is represented by a declining number in a government projection advancing towards zero. The decisions made now about where to live, how to allocate water, and how seriously to treat the projections produced by federal scientists will determine the scope and human cost of what comes next. These realities deserve broad public understanding and serious, sustained engagement from every level of government, industry, and civil society. Some truths carry consequences too significant to be left unexamined. Amazing. Discoveries. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Share this video with friends and join the discussion on what these findings could mean. Your thoughts and questions are important, so let's explore incredible mysteries together.